the weight of Mr. Chauvin, correct?
Yes.
And how you obtained that information?
Correct.
And whether you took into consideration the weight of Mr. Chauvin's equipment and body-worn armor and things of that nature?
Correct.
To your knowledge, have you ever been provided with any actual weights of what a duty belt, its accoutrements, the body armor actually weighs?
No.
Have you ever, to your knowledge, in the materials that you received, did the state of Minnesota ever conduct any such weighing experiments?
None that I saw.
And you were asked those questions relevant, would you agree?
Oh, good point. Because they just estimated that it was 30 pounds from the expert, which I think is really high. So by making this point, and I don't know if he made it clear to the jury, the prosecution was making it seem like you didn't do a good job, but the prosecution never weighed it either.
Relevant to the analysis of positional asphyxia, correct?
That is my understanding, yes.
Now, you would also were asked a series of questions about the bruising, things of that nature that you would see or anticipate seeing in these types of cases, right?
Yes.
Would the amount of weight that a person have, in your opinion, increase or decrease the likelihood of seeing such abrasions, whether it be below the skin or in the muscles?
The more energy that is applied to that particular part of the body, the more likelihood there's going to be an injury. And the heavier the person, the more likelihood there's going to be more energy. So yes, heavier people are more likely to cause injury to an individual.
And in your practice, whether it be as a pathologist, or excuse me, the chief pathologist in Maryland, or through the forensics panel, or any of your other private endeavors, have you ever reviewed cases of positional asphyxia?
Yes, numerous.
And have you seen those types of injuries in other cases?
Yes, I have.
And do you, in those cases, did you have the luxury of comparing it to body-worn cameras and things of that nature?
No, body-worn cameras are a relatively new source of information for us. For many years, we were restricted to statements.
You were asked a series of questions about what type of testing you performed relevant to the CO2. Do you recall those questions?
Yes, I do.
Okay. You testified that your report was submitted on February 22nd of this year, correct?
Correct.
Did your report that you prepared include your assessment involving the potential for CO2 or carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide in Mr. Floyd?
Yes, it did.
Since February 22nd, have you been provided with any tests, experiments, any information that the state of Minnesota did similar types of testing?
No, I have not been provided with any such information.
But since that time, were you provided with photographs of the bottom of the squad car 320?
Yes, I was.
Has that been since this trial has started?
Yes, it's been within the last couple of days, to the best of my recollection.
You were shown a couple of photographs of Mr. Floyd in a brief blurb, a video blurb while he was in the Cup Foods store and asked to see if there was something in his mouth.
Yes.
And can you say that what that was with any specificity in his mouth at that time?
No.
Can you say that what was in his mouth in Cup Foods was the same object you saw in his mouth in his vehicle when Officer Lane approached him?
No.
Can you say that the things found in the back of the car was the same thing that was in his mouth that was in the store? Bring in the stuff found in the car. Come on, dude.
Would you agree that at the drugs that were found in Squad Car 320, to your knowledge, contained Mr. Floyd's DNA?
Objectively. Sustain, rephrase.
What do you know about the drugs that were found in the back of Squad 320?
There were white, what looked like tablet remnants, and they were tested for Mr. Floyd's DNA, and I believe they were also tested for his saliva. And they were positive for both.
And those were methamphetamine and or fentanyl?
Yes.
Do you recall, again, whether Mr. Floyd was handcuffed while in the squad car?
Yes, I did not see him have his handcuffs removed at any time until such time as resuscitation started. And that's the period all the way from when the handcuffs were first applied to him outside his own vehicle.
Immediately in the sort of the door frame of the vehicle?
Yes.
And prior to that point, at any point, did you see any videotapes of Mr. Floyd going into Squad 320 prior to the police being present?
No. No.
Now, you were asked a series of questions about an affidavit that was prepared by Mr. Ray, or Dr. Ray, I should say, back in 2005. Were you familiar with the intricacies of this particular litigation?
No, I'd never seen that affidavit before, and I have no idea what the litigation was about.
Do you have any idea as to the context of this document?
No.
Now, you were asked about a couple of paragraphs where he apparently does not retract his position on positional asphyxia.
Correct.
And you skipped over, or you were asked to skip over a couple of other...
I told you he'd come back and let him clarify that. He wanted to cover the paragraph before.
paragraphs as well, correct?
Yes.
Would it refresh your recollection to review the affidavit and put his statements within the proper context as you view them?
Yes.
My approach? Thank you.
I kind of like this guy. Although I think he could have gave the DA a little bit more shit. He's a pretty good witness. And he kind of like, it is what it is. I mean, there was a couple of questions that the DA asked him that he paused on.
Yes. What was the context of those statements?
Well, the context is not specifically stated as to why he was making this statement.
Okay. Were there other statements that he made that you found important?
Yes.
What were those?
There was one here which says a 280-pound man with a large abdominal paniculus, i.e. protuberant belly, is at risk in the face-down position, as well as a person with obstructive pulmonary disease. And there are many shades in between. So Dr. Donald Ray never retracted his opinion as to obese individuals, but he did at one time or another state that the average person who is muscular and not compromised in any way would have no risk.
And that was in relation to the Chan studies out of San Francisco?
Right. And then he then goes on to say, not enough is known to say whether or not a method of restraint is free from any potential lethal effects. Basically, not enough, no.
There wasn't enough information.
Correct.
So he just kind of implied that the DA was trying to trick the jury. I would have added, so you weren't trying to mislead the jury by giving them false information. The DA didn't give you the full information when he asked your opinion, correct? I would have stuck that in there so the jury's like, that motherfucker was misleading, not me. Sorry, cases.
You were asked a series of questions about whether you're a pulmonologist or a toxicologist, etc., correct?
Correct.
You're a pathologist, correct?
That is my training and expertise, yes.
Do you treat living patients?
No.
How do the patients that you observe appear to you?
They are deceased.
Are people, you were asked a series of questions about your work with the forensic panel, whether it was a non-profit organization or whether it was some volunteer time. Do you recall those questions?
Yes, I do.
And it was, forensic panel is a business, correct?
Yes.
Fair to say. Would you change your opinion simply by virtue of the fact you are being paid?
No, not at all.
Are people who volunteer their time more trustworthy in your experience?
Objection, Your Honor, for Roman.
Sustained.
Calls for include. Yeah, I would agree. It's not his area expertise. He got the
You were
point out.
asked a series of questions about a 4-minute time period where applying pressure to the neck, maintaining it there for 4 minutes would cause irreversible brain damage. Remember those?
Yes, that was a very specific question.
Can you expound on that a little bit more? What types of variables might affect that?
Well, basically anything which stops blood getting to the brain for 4 minutes will cause irreversible brain damage. Not just a asphyxial process, but a process where the blood has stopped being pumped to the brain.
So if the heart stops circulating blood, stops processing oxygen to the brain, 4 minutes, irreversible brain damage.
Yes, well, for whatever reason the brain stops getting oxygen, after 4 minutes, the current medical literature considers that there is a high likelihood of irreversible damage to that brain.
Do you recall that question that counsel asked you specifically relevant to the position of Mr. Floyd or Mr. Chauvin's knee?
Yes, he did.
Based upon your review of the video in this case, did you observe Mr. Chauvin's knee obstructing the carotid artery of Mr. Floyd?
That knee did not obstruct either carotid artery. And even if it had obstructed one, the carotid artery on the other side, plus the 2 vertebral arteries, would continue to supply the brain with enough blood for it to function.
You were also asked a series of questions on cross-examination about traumatic manifestations and the frequency with which you may expect them, correct?
Yes.
And I believe in this regard you were shown some language out of a Spitz and Fisher book.
Yes.
When was that Spitz and Fisher book published?
I did not see which edition it was.
Okay.
There have been 5 editions, so that I don't know. And the other thing there was the wording was different. It said often no signs of physical, not usually, which was my recollection of the question. And again, I apologize if I misheard the question. But,
So there are cases where you may have a positional asphyxia case that does not show these traumatic manifestations. Agreed?
yes, absolutely.
Would you agree likewise that there are cases of positional asphyxiation where you do see these traumatic manifestations?
Yes.
And in your experience with these types of cases, is it common to see bruising, petechia, things of that nature?
It is very common.
Now, you were asked a question about whether or not any of the studies on positional asphyxia and prone restraint ever reviewed a 9-minute and 29-second time period?
Yes, the laboratory studies.
Are you familiar with the cardiopulmonary effects of physical restraint in subjects with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease in the Journal of Clinical Forensic Medicine?
Yes, I think I have. I believe I read that article.
Would it refresh your recollection to just review it briefly?
Please.
May I approach?
Thank you. Yes, I believe that I have actually seen this particular paper on individuals with chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases.
Does it include
I'm familiar
positional,
with it.
prone positioning greater than 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
Yes.
You were asked a couple of questions about a deposition testimony you gave in Curtis versus Prince County. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Fair to say that was one small portion of a larger deposition testimony?
Yes, and the reference to burking kind of cut off the second part of burking.
What is burping?
So it's a process where somebody would sit on somebody's chest to restrict chest movements. At the same time, somebody else would be applying another method of asphyxia to them, often suffocation.
And that was in order to basically get cadavers?
Yes, they were doing. They were in the business of obtaining cadavers for medical study, and they wanted people that didn't have any significant injuries. This was a method by which these two individuals figured out they could kill people without leaving any marks on them, and then sell the cadavers for medical study.
Gotcha. And I believe, and I don't have, unfortunately, the transcript accessible on the computer, but I believe you referenced multiple officers or something to that effect being on the actual torso, correct?
In that particular case, yes.
You were asked a series of questions. Let me ask you this real quick. You were asked a question about Dr. Baker's finding at autopsy relevant to the stomach contents.
Yes.
To your knowledge, were the stomach contents ever tested or analyzed for any toxicological substances?
I never saw any reporting on the stomach contents being analyzed in the laboratory for any substances that may be present.
And if Dr. Baker testified that his office maintains those samples for other doctors, other people to review, or have you been made aware of any tests that were conducted subsequent to Dr. Baker's autopsy on the stomach contents of Mr. Floyd?
I'm not aware of any studies that were done on that material.
You were asked again a series of questions about EELV, and there was a question about the oxygen reserves. Do you recall generally?
Yes.
In terms of the oxygen reserves, where in your, based on your experience, are the main oxygen reserves stored?
The main oxygen reserve, in my opinion, is within the blood. That's the dissolved oxygen that's already attached to the hemoglobin. And that will continue to circulate around the body for a period of time. What is in the lungs is part of the exchange process. I would not call that an oxygen reserve.
Now, in terms of this particular case and the measurements of EELV, were you aware of any pulmonologists or respiratory therapists measuring Mr. Floyd's EELV during the course of this incident?
No. There is no evidence that that happened, and obviously it's not on the video, so it did not happen.
And so any measurement would be theoretical?
Yes.
Would be theoretical and an opinion. Making
You were,
some good points.
Asked a question about Mr. Floyd saying that he couldn't breathe, right? Do you recall those questions?
Yes.
And making those statements in the context of being in the prone position, correct?
Correct.
Based on your review, do you recall hearing Mr. Floyd make similar statements prior to being placed in the prone restraint position?
Yes, that's my recollection.
You were asked a question about the anoxic seizure that you observed in the video,
Yes.
and that's recognizable as an anoxic seizure to you, a physician, right?
Yes.
And a seizure generally involves a pretty significant amount of motion or movement. Objectively, Your Honor.
Rephrase, sustained.
How would you describe in this particular case what you observed in terms of the anoxic seizure?
A small amount of twitching and or extension of a body part, which is very classical of hypoxic seizures, often commonly described by in situations where people have a sudden cardiac event, as well as any other. It's just a situation of the brain not getting enough oxygen, and very different from the grand mal type seizure that you would see in an epileptic, which are much, much more vigorous.
And recognizable to you as a physician or other physicians with comparable experience?
Yes.
To your knowledge, is Mr. Chauvin a physician of 27 years?
No.
Good point. He has to get out that all these observations from all these medical experts is not viewing it from Mr. Chauvin's perspective.
You were asked a question about PEA, pulseless electrical activity, right?
Yes.
Can a PEA arrhythmia occur from a cardiac origin?
Yes.
You were asked a second series of questions about EELV measurements in terms of, and again, I understand you're not a pulmonologist, right? Are people variable?
Every one of us as a human being is completely individual and different from the person standing next to us, yes.
You were asked a series of questions about the paraganglioma
Yes.
and whether you recalled Mr. Floyd ever saying or complaining of a headache.
I recall that question, yes.
Do you recall Mr. Floyd saying that everything hurts?
Yes.
Do you recall him at any time saying his head hurts?
I have a recollection of it, but I cannot put my finger on it. It's just in my memory.
Paraganglioma, if gone unrecognized, can that cause hypertension?
Yes. Specifically if it's one of the forms that does secrete adrenaline.
Continuously or
Both.
So you were asked a series of questions about, you would agree your agreement that it's important not to mislead the jury, right?
Correct?
I was waiting for him to bring that up because he used that line a lot.
And you were shown a couple of still photographs of time from a body-worn camera where it appeared that Mr. Chauvin had his arm around the neck of Mr. Floyd.
In that area, yes.
Based upon your recollection, do you know if that was a moment in time during which Mr. Floyd made those comments?
I don't have an association of that hold with him making a statement. And I recall it being fairly brief, a brief period that the arm was around the neck.
I'd like to show you about a 1-minute portion of Exhibit 43, which is already in evidence. How's body camera?
Oh, he's trying to slam the prosecution in front of the jury. Perfect. I hope it pays off. We'll see if it's clear.
Please, please, mate, please. No, I can't choke. I can't breathe, buddy. Please.
Do you hear what Mr. Floyd is saying in that second?
Yes.
Do you see where he's located in the squad car?
He's closest to the sidewalk at that particular stage, yes. On the driver's side of the vehicle.
Do you observe Mr. Chauvin at that point?
No.
Quite again.
No, I can't choke. I can't breathe, buddy. Please.
I'm sorry, if you can just keep
Sit down. My wrist, man. My wrist, man. Okay, I'm on the ground. I'm on the ground. I'm on the ground. I'm going down. I'm going down. I'm not going to run, man. Wait. I know I can't breathe. I can't breathe. You're talking to me. Oxygen. I can't breathe. I just had COVID, man. I can't breathe. Okay.
Do you observe that in that instance?
Yes.
Did it appear to you that Mr. Chauvin had a tight, firm grip around Mr. Floyd's neck?
No, actually it looked very loose, and the hand was actually gripping the back of the neck in the sort of spinal column area with a considerable gap in the front.
Thank you, Doctor. I have no further questions.
Any further, Mr. Ruffalo?
So he ended with slamming about misleading the jury. I freaking love it. Finally, he grew some balls.
Rounds of questions about Dr. Fowler, just for a point of clarification, you've been asked a couple of rounds of questions about the drugs found in Squad 320. To be clear, what we're talking about is one pill, right?
No, there was one pill and there were several partial pills on the seat, from what I remember.
I don't recall if it's one or two, but it was one of those two numbers, yes.
One partially dissolved pill, right?
I thought it was two, but I stand corrected, Counselor.
And in the back of Squad 320, you didn't see any footage of Mr. Floyd spitting a pill out, did you?
No, I did not.
Now, you asked questions about the measurements of the EELV, and I think you arrived at the conclusion with Mr. Nelson that there could have been theoretical measurements made. Did you make any theoretical measurements of the EELV as a part of your analysis in this case?
Ask and
No, I did
answer.
not.
I'm going to ask you about, again, the 9 minutes and 29 seconds. The last 9 minutes and 29 seconds of Mr. Floyd's life during the subdual under restraint. to be sure I understand your testimony. So if we focus just on the period of time when Mr. Floyd is on the ground, the subdual, the restraint, and the neck compression, can you tell us whether it is your opinion as to whether or not Mr. Chauvin's actions played any role in the death of Mr. Floyd during the subdual, restraint, and compression on the ground?
Whoa, any role? That's a good question. Because I think one of the definitions of one of the laws is if you contribute in any way to someone's death, then you get, I think it might be murder 3 there. Because that's what they're going to charge a drug dealer with. He provided the drugs, therefore he can be drugged with murder 3 because he contributed in any way to that. This question, this answer is very critical. And man, you better tread lightly on that one. Because if he gets them to say, yes, he contributed, he sets the stage for him getting them for murder 3.
Sustained.
Sustained. Oh! I don't know what the objection was.
Restraint and compression on the ground.
Objection.
Can you restraint and compression on the ground?
Sustained.
Oh, whatever the good objection, dude. That was a critical objection. You do not want him answering that. Anybody that says, yes, he contributed, I think locks him into the drug dealer charge.
Can you tell us whether it's your view that Mr. Floyd's passing after the 9 minutes and 29 seconds was coincidental and unrelated to the subdual and restraint on the ground?
Sustained.
Sustained again. Shut him down.
No further questions for you.
I freaking love it. Yes. What a way to end.
Thank you very much. Helpful sidebar.
Sidebar. Let's see if what they're gonna tell us.
And members of the jury, just checking on how long the next witness would take. I think it is the best way to do this is to schedule that for tomorrow. So we're going to release you for today. We'll start up between 9:15 and 9:30.
Okay, looks like it's over. We'll end that one for today and be back tomorrow. Tomorrow might be the last day of testimony. And then Friday will be off and Monday will be closing arguments. Oh, you know what? I take that back. The prosecution's going to cry that their expert medical guy messed up their expert medical guy, and they want to bring back the medical guy to undo what their medical guy did. So again, this will be a dirty trick by the prosecution to get their witness up on a stand again. And you can probably expect that because the judge said he would let him do that. All right, we'll end that there.